6.3 million people have been internally displaced and 3.5 million others are living as refugees in East African countries and the Horn of Africa. This is attributed to long-standing conflicts, drought, human rights abuses, political and economic instabilities. To talk to me about this, I'm joined now by Ottilia Anna Maunganidze, head of the special projects at the Institute for Security Studies. Anna, good evening and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight on In Focus. I believe as the ISS, you will be holding a dialogue around this regional approach to addressing issues of concern around migration. First and foremost, Kelly, you believe that there needs to be a multilateral response if we are to manage the migration concerns successfully. What is the value, do you think, that sits in this multilateral approach?
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be talking about this today with you. We did host a seminar earlier today that focused on questions around mixed migration challenges within East Africa and the Horn. Now, as you know, countries have their own national laws that deal with or how best to manage and govern questions related to migration, whether it's forced migration as a result of conflict, war, and other forms of situations of violence, for example. But the reality is most people, while they may not be safe within their countries, will choose to cross borders to their neighboring countries. Now, if neighboring countries don't have the same legal frameworks or legal approaches to how they deal with questions of displacement, the result is almost a disconnect between the reality on the ground and the law that needs to be applied. So from our point of view, where you can be able to have a regional and a coordinated approach to deal with questions of migration, the better. It also allows for responsibility sharing, such that one country in a particular region is not the country that has the most refugees or asylum seekers that they have to deal with, but actually manage the responsibility with neighboring countries.
How does this work when different countries in the region, for example, have different needs, have got different resources, they've got different political and economic systems, they've got different migration patterns? How do you get them to coordinate?
So East Africa is a good case study, if I can, of the fact that when you are responding to a crisis, sometimes it's not so much out of choice that you do that, but it's simply because of geography. The countries that we have seen that are stepping up and trying to respond comprehensively to influx of refugees, but also to manage the impact on host communities, are countries like Uganda. Uganda is by no measure a high-income country. It's not even a medium-income country. And so their approach to responding to refugees is to say it's not on the state exclusively to be able to offer assistance, so to speak, but if refugees, which is often the case, are people that already have qualifications, degrees, or expertise in a particular field, they should be allowed to work. They obviously get a refugee permit in order for them to be able to do that. But what that has done in a society like Uganda is it's meant that refugees apply for jobs just as well as locals would, and instead they aren't just a humanitarian concern for which the government has to fundraise. Now, other countries in the region have encampment policies, so they put refugees within camps. We've seen, for example, a neighboring Kenya that has for years been trying to close one of its biggest refugee camp, Dadaab, is that encampment policies don't always work, especially if you don't have a long-term strategy. So learning within the region, what are the best ways with limited resources that you can able to handle an influx of migrants is pretty much the only way to go. Because these are not high-income countries, and in fact countries for whom the citizens themselves may also need social protections as well as economic and financial support.
What has been the approach up until now, particularly on that question that you raised, to minimize the impact on the host country? What role have neighboring countries in the region played? I'm talking here, for example, in the South African context and Zimbabwean context. Is there a commitment from the neighboring country to play a particular role in lightening the burden on the host country?
Mm. Right, so I'll speak first about East Africa, then I'll move southwards to Southern Africa. So for East Africa, we've seen those countries like Uganda I mentioned that are part of the rolling out of a comprehensive refugee response framework, that they've actually recognized, unlike in the 1950s when the International Refugee Convention was adopted, that economic opportunities as a means to limit the burden, if I can put it that way, of refugees and societies is pretty much the key way to go. That means whether it's allowing for employment opportunities, allowing for things like vegetable gardens, for example, farming in some areas, that has helped to lessen the burden on the host nation. Now, the situation that has led Uganda to host so many refugees is because of neighboring conflicts in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, South Sudan, and the Central African Republic. Now, these are countries that at this point aren't able themselves to actually offer any other support to Uganda in order to deal with the refugee problem because they're dealing with raging conflicts. The situation is a little bit different when we move southwards in South Africa, where the majority of people that are moving towards South Africa are not necessarily refugees that are fleeing conflict, but are different categories of what we dub mixed migrants. So those are anything from economic migrants, people seeking family reunification, and those seeking job opportunities. Now, the relationship that ought to be forged between neighboring countries, you cite the example of Zimbabwe in your question, is that they have to have that dialogue. Now, in Southern Africa, we have a migration dialogue for Southern Africa, which is for all 16 member states of SADC. Member states don't always agree. Yeah. Some prefer a securitized approach to dealing with migration, while others lean more towards an international protection approach. Our view from the Institute for Security Studies is, regardless of which policy position countries take, what we know for a fact is that people are going to move, and people are going to go on dangerous journeys if they're unable to go through legal channels. So the push really should be to ensuring that those people that do migrate do so through legal channels. Because if you don't encourage legal migration, illicit migration or people that are then smuggled into countries actually cause difficulties policy-wise, because you don't know the exact numbers of people that are in a country. You also don't know what social services need to be provided. So the more countries actually speak together, I know it sounds trite to suggest that countries need to come to the table, have discussions about how best to manage migration, not necessarily to control it, but to manage it in a way that is governable.
Yeah. Interesting that you mentioned that, because my next question to you was to ask you how effective are these regional consultative processes, because they are really, again, voluntarily non-binding, and because they're non-binding, nations generally do tend to participate in them. That in itself, they're saying it's a plus, it is attractive. But coming out of there, are there any tangible solutions that come out to managing the situation of migration?
Right, so dialogue is only part of the engagement. We've seen efforts at sub-regional level, so within the region, towards negotiating multilateral agreements between countries. So, for example, Zambia, Botswana, and Zimbabwe have